I have always liked being alone on trails, even when the miles stretched too far and the weather turned against me. Something about being far from the noise of the city made me feel clear in the head. But the hike I did that summer changed the way I looked at being alone in the woods. It stopped being about peace and started being about survival. It was July, and the air was heavy and dry. I had been looking at a loop trail in the northern mountains for weeks. It was long, close to 20 miles if I did the full circle, and it passed through a wide valley with streams, forest ridges, and exposed rocky parts where the sun beat down. Most people split it into 2 days with camping gear, but I had convinced myself I could push through it in one long day if I left before sunrise. I packed light, just water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a map folded in my pocket, and my phone with a power bank. No tent, no stove, just me, boots, and a trail that cut through miles of rough country. I parked my car at the trailhead before 5 a.m. The gravel lot was empty. The sky was still dark, but the horizon carried a dull gray glow. The air was cool in the early morning, but I knew it would heat up once the sun cleared the ridge. I strapped my pack tighter and started walking, the crunch of my boots loud on the dirt path. The first miles were easy. The trail ran flat through mixed pine and aspen forest. A thin mist hung between the trees. The ground was damp, soft from rain earlier in the week. Birds started calling as the light grew. My legs felt strong, and I kept a steady pace, breathing easy, swinging my arms to loosen up. By the time the sun was up, I was deep into the first stretch. The trail crossed small streams and climbed gradually toward higher ground. I passed a couple of wooden bridges, slick with moss, and stepped carefully so I wouldn't slip. I didn't see anyone. It was odd, but I told myself most hikers probably started later. After about 5 miles, the woods opened up to a ridge. The view was wide, valleys rolling out below with fog burning off in patches. The silence was so complete it felt heavy. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving across dry grass. I stopped for a drink and checked my map. I was right on course. The trail looped down into the valley next, then curved through denser woods before climbing again. The descent into the valley was steeper than I thought. The dirt was loose, and I had to brace my knees. The trail twisted between boulders and thick undergrowth. By then the sun was higher, and the heat pressed down. The valley air was damp and still. I pushed on, swatting at insects, drinking more water than I had planned. The deeper I went, the more the trail narrowed. The trees grew close together, trunks leaning in, branches forming a kind of tunnel. The ground was uneven, with roots sticking out. My boots caught a few times, and I stumbled but didn't fall. I started feeling the weight of the miles in my calves and hips. I stopped to eat a bar and check my water. Half of what I carried was already gone, and I wasn't even halfway around the loop. That was the first time I felt a flicker of worry. The map showed a stream farther ahead, though. I told myself I'd refill there with my filter. I kept going, but I began to notice things that made me uneasy. The trail markers grew fewer. Some were faded, nailed to trees years ago, their paint peeling. In places, fallen branches hid the path, and I had to step over or around them. At one point, I lost the trail completely when it crossed a patch of rocks. I wandered for several minutes before spotting a faint line of dirt where others had walked. The woods pressed close. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat. The silence that had felt peaceful earlier now felt oppressive. I hadn't seen a single person since the parking lot, and it was nearing noon. When I reached the stream, relief rushed through me. I knelt by the water, pulled out my filter, and filled my bottle. The cold water steadied me. I sat for a while, letting my legs rest. The valley air smelled of damp leaves and mud. But as I sat there, I thought I heard movement upstream, a soft crack of branches. Not the rustle of a squirrel, but heavier. I froze, staring through the trees. Nothing moved. No voices, no figures. Just the stream running. I forced myself to breathe slow. Maybe a deer. Maybe nothing at all. I stood, tightened my pack, and moved on. The trail beyond the stream was worse. Climbed sharply, switchback after switchback. The heat beat down harder, the air thick. Sweat stung my eyes. My thighs burned. I leaned forward, gripping my knees at times to keep going. By the time I reached the top of that climb, I was drained. My watch said I had covered close to 12 miles. That left 8 more if I stuck to the full loop. But I wasn't sure if I could keep my pace. I pulled out the map again, studying it carefully. I noticed something I had skimmed over earlier, a cut-off trail that cut across the loop, shaving off several miles. It looked less used, thinner lines marked on the paper, but it led back toward the trailhead. That sounded better than dragging myself around the long way. I found the junction a little while later. The main trail was wide, dirt packed from many boots. The cutoff was narrow, almost overgrown, grass pushing in. The wooden sign pointing the way was weathered. One corner snapped off. I hesitated, then turned onto the cutoff. At first it was fine, just rougher, less clear. But the farther I went, the less it looked like a trail. Grass grew knee-high, branches hung low. The dirt faded to patches of bare rock and mud. I kept glancing back, telling myself I was still on the right track. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print in the mud ahead, half sunk and blurred. Fresh enough that rain hadn't washed it away, but not sharp. It meant someone else had used this cutoff at some point, but how long ago? Days? Weeks? Pushed on, nerves prickling. The sun dipped behind clouds, and shadows deepened. The air cooled, but with it came a rising wind that hissed through the trees. The cutoff twisted, climbed, then dropped again. I checked the map over and over, but the lines didn't match what I saw. I couldn't tell if I had drifted off or if the trail itself was just poorly marked. Time dragged. My water ran lower. The power bank on my phone showed 2 bars left, but I had no signal. Every ridge looked the same, every hollow thick with tangled brush. My legs ached from stepping over fallen trees. My arms scratched raw from pushing branches aside. Then came the moment I realized I was lost. The cutoff trail simply ended in a patch of rocks and brush. No signs, no blazes, no clear way forward. I turned in circles, searching for the path, but all I saw were trees and stone. My stomach dropped. I walked back the way I thought I had come, but the ground looked different. The grass bent in every direction. After 10 minutes, I admitted to myself I couldn't find the trail again. Panic edged in. I fought it down, forcing myself to think. I had the map, but without knowing exactly where I stood, the paper meant little. I knew the trailhead was west, so I tried to keep the sun on my left and move steadily, but the woods grew rougher. Thick underbrush slowed me to a crawl. Rocks jutted out, slick with moss. My boots slipped, and once I fell hard on my hip, pain shooting up my side. I lay there, wind knocked out, staring at the canopy above. That was when the fear fully hit. The idea of being stuck here overnight, alone, with no trail and no one knowing where I was. I forced myself up, limping, brushing dirt from my skin. I kept walking, slower, my eyes scanning constantly for any sign of a trail. Hours seemed to pass. The light shifted toward evening. The forest darkened. At one point, I heard movement again, branches cracking behind me. I spun, heart hammering, but saw nothing. The silence closed in again, heavier than before. As dusk fell, I stumbled into a clearing. My legs trembled with exhaustion. I dropped my pack, sat on a rock, and tried to steady my breathing. The clearing was ringed with trees, the grass high in the center. No trail in sight. I decided I couldn't keep wandering in the dark. I gathered sticks and dry leaves, using my lighter to build a small fire. The flames gave me some comfort, but the shadows around the clearing seemed alive. Every snap of wood made me jump. I chewed a few bites of food, forcing myself to eat though I had no appetite. My throat was dry. I sipped the last of my water, knowing it wouldn't last till morning. Sleep came in broken stretches. I doze, then wake at the smallest sound. Once I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a dark shape slipping between trunks. But when I stared, it was gone. Maybe a deer, maybe just my mind. When dawn came, the fire had burned low. My body ached from the cold ground. My throat burned with thirst. I packed up and started west again, pushing through brush, eyes gritty with fatigue. Hours passed. The sun climbed high. My head throbbed. My lips cracked. I started my hike early in the morning with the air still damp from the night. I could see dew clinging to the grass and the leaves of the small plants near the trailhead. The sun was rising slowly behind the hills, sending weak rays of light through the branches. The forest around me was silent except for the distant call of a bird that echoed through the trees. I had planned this hike for weeks. I had checked maps, packed supplies, and made sure I had everything I needed. My backpack was heavy, but it felt reassuring to know I had food, water, a first aid kit, and some tools with me. The trail was narrow and mostly dirt, with some stones scattered across it. At first, it was easy to follow, lined with markings on trees and occasional wooden posts. I kept a steady pace, listening to the crunch of soil and twigs under my boots. I enjoyed the quiet and the sense of being far away from everything. For the first few hours, it was peaceful. After a while, the forest grew denser. The trees became taller and closer together, their branches blocking more of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, and the ground was damp. I noticed the soil was darker here, almost black in places. My boots left deep prints, and sometimes I felt the mud pull at them. I slowed down, making sure not to slip. I reached a small clearing where the trail split. According to the map I had studied, both paths eventually joined again, but one was longer and climbed higher along the ridge. I chose the ridge path because I wanted the view. The climb was steep, and my legs began to burn after a while. Sweat collected under my shirt, but the cool air helped. I stopped to catch my breath and took a long drink from my water bottle. The silence here felt heavier. The forest didn't sound alive like it had earlier. The ridge trail narrowed as it climbed higher. On one side, the slope rose sharply, covered with rocks and moss. On the other side, it dropped down into a thick mess of trees and bushes. I couldn't see the bottom, only shadows. My pack felt heavier with each step, and I shifted it on my shoulders to make it more bearable. Hours passed, and the sun rose higher. The trees thinned out near the top of the ridge, and the ground turned rocky. The air smelled of stone and pine. When I finally reached a flat stretch, I set my pack down and looked around. From there, I could see across the valley. The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of green broken only by the curve of a distant river. For a few minutes, I forgot about the weight of the hike and simply stood there breathing deeply. But when I picked up my pack and continued, things began to feel different. The trail markings became harder to spot. Some trees didn't have them at all, and the posts looked weathered and broken. I paused to check my map, but without GPS I had to rely on landmarks, and the ridge made everything look the same. Still, I pressed on, sure that the trail would become clearer. I didn't realize how far I had gone until the sun began sinking lower in the sky. The light shifted to a pale orange, and the shadows grew long. I hadn't expected to still be on this trail by evening. According to my original plan, I should have looped back down hours ago. My water bottle was nearly half empty, and I had eaten only a small snack bar. I stopped and looked around. The path ahead was faint, barely a trail anymore, more like a natural gap between rocks and shrubs. My chest tightened as I realized I might have taken a wrong turn earlier. I pulled out the map again, but nothing seemed to match exactly. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I could always retrace my steps. I turned back, but the way behind me looked different than I remembered. The shadows made it worse. Every tree looked the same, and the ridge curved in ways that confused me. I walked for some time, certain I was going the right way, but the trail kept breaking apart. At one point, I stepped over a fallen tree, and when I looked back, I realized I wasn't even sure which side I had come from. The air grew colder as the sun sank lower. The forest seemed to press closer around me. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears. I had been lost before on short hikes, but had always found my way back quickly. This was different. This was miles from the trailhead, in a section I didn't know well. As night fell, the ridge turned dark and silent. I pulled out my flashlight, its thin beam cutting through the trees. The ground glowed pale where the light hit it, but everything else was swallowed by blackness. I knew I couldn't keep hiking in the dark. It was too risky. One wrong step near the edge could send me tumbling down into the forest below. I found a flat patch of ground near some rocks and decided to stop there. I unrolled my emergency blanket, sat on it, and tried to calm down. My pack was still full of supplies, but the thought of spending the night out here alone filled me with unease. Every rustle in the bushes made me tighten my grip on the flashlight. The wind through the trees sometimes sounded like faint movements. I didn't sleep much. My eyes kept snapping open at the sound of branches creaking or leaves shifting. At one point, I thought I heard heavy steps somewhere in the distance, but when I shined the flashlight around, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted, my body stiff from the cold. The forest looked different in daylight, but that didn't make it less confusing. I ate a protein bar, drank the last of my water, and packed up. I told myself I had to move steadily and not panic. I would eventually find a landmark or a clearer trail. As the day dragged on, my mouth grew dry. I hadn't passed any streams, and the sun was beating down harder now. My lips cracked, and my throat felt like sandpaper. I rationed what little food I had left, but it did nothing against the thirst. By mid-afternoon, I started hearing things again. Twigs snapping behind me, like something following at a distance. Each time I stopped and turned, the forest stood still. My skin prickled, and I felt exposed on the ridge. Later, while trying to scramble down toward what looked like a game trail, I slipped on loose rocks and fell hard, scraping my arm and twisting my ankle. Pain shot up my leg, and for a moment I just lay there breathing heavily. When I stood up, I realized I couldn't put much weight on my ankle without limping. The cut on my arm bled slowly, and I wrapped it with a strip of cloth from my pack. That was when fear truly set in. Limping, dehydrated, and lost miles from help, I began to realize how serious this was. I thought of search parties, of people finding my pack days later. The image chilled me. I pushed on anyway, forcing myself forward. Every step felt slower, heavier. The ridge seemed endless, twisting and stretching on without end. I looked down once and thought I saw movement in the forest below, but I told myself it was just shadows. That night, I didn't even bother to set up properly. I just sat against a tree, too tired to eat. My flashlight flickered, the battery low, and I turned it off to save what was left. In the darkness, I listened to the forest. I thought I heard breathing once, slow and steady, not my own. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. When morning came again, my body felt weak, my throat dry to the point where swallowing hurt. I stumbled forward, dragging my bad ankle. At one point, I heard rushing water and nearly cried with relief. I followed the sound, clawing through bushes and sliding down a slope until I reached a narrow stream. I fell to my knees and drank greedily, the cold water burning my throat but saving me. That gave me strength to keep going. I followed the stream, reasoning it had to lead somewhere. For hours I limped alongside it, the ground uneven and rough. The forest seemed less dense here, and eventually I spotted signs of human presence. An old, rusted fence half buried in vines. My chest filled with hope. I pushed on, and finally, after what felt like days, I stumbled onto a dirt service road. The sight of tire tracks in the mud nearly broke me with relief. I followed it slowly, every step painful, until I saw a cabin in the distance. It looked old, maybe used by rangers or hunters. The cabin was empty, but there were signs of use. A fire pit, stacked wood, empty cans. I knew someone would return eventually. I stayed there, drinking from the stream nearby, resting my ankle and waiting. It took another day, but finally, I heard the distant sound of an engine. A truck appeared on the road, and when it stopped, the driver stared at me like I had crawled out of the earth. My clothes were torn, my face sunburned, my body filthy. They gave me water and took me back to town. I had been gone for 4 days. The memory of that ridge still clings to me. The silence of the forest, the feeling of being watched, the taste of cold water when I thought I might not make it. I think about how easily I could have slipped, or how no one knew exactly where I was. It taught me a lesson I'll never forget. how small and fragile a person feels when lost in the wilderness, and how quickly confidence can turn into survival. I had been hiking for years, but that trip in the mountains was the one that burned itself into my memory in a way I never expected. I went alone, which wasn't unusual for me. I liked the quiet and the space it gave me to think. I wasn't careless about it. I usually planned my hikes in detail, carried maps, checked the weather, and packed extra food and water. But no matter how much planning I did, nothing prepared me for what happened that day. It was the middle of summer, and the sun was already up by the time I parked at the trailhead. The air was warm but not yet heavy, and there was a faint breeze that made the leaves shift against each other. I had decided to take a long loop trail that climbed high up along a ridge before dropping down into a valley and circling back. On the map, it was about 12 miles, but I had done longer hikes before and I felt ready for it. My pack was loaded with water, energy bars, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight, even though I didn't plan to be out past dark. I also had a knife clipped to my belt and a whistle. Those items had become routine for me, even if I had never once needed to use them in any serious way. I laced my boots tight, locked my car, and started walking up the path. The first part of the trail wound through tall pines. The ground was soft with layers of needles, and the air carried that sharp smell of resin. I could hear birds calling in short bursts, the kind that echo between trees and then disappear quickly. The sun filtered down in long strips of light, catching dust motes that floated slowly through the air. I walked steadily, feeling strong, and the climb didn't bother me. After about 2 miles, the trees began to thin, and the trail steepened. The ground turned rocky, with sharp edges jutting out, and my boots crunched against the grit. The higher I went, the more I could feel the breeze pick up, pushing at my back when I turned in the right direction. I stopped once to sip water and look back. From there, I could see the parking lot as a small square far below, my car just a speck. Beyond that was a wide stretch of hills rolling into the distance, hazy in the morning light. I kept moving, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. The ridge was the section I had been both looking forward to and dreading. On the map, it showed a narrow trail following the spine of the mountain for almost a mile before widening again. Reviews online had warned about it, saying it wasn't for anyone afraid of heights. I wasn't afraid exactly, but I respected places like that. A single misstep on loose rock could be enough to end everything. When I reached the start of it, I paused. The trail rose sharply and then leveled off, but I could already see how narrow it became. On one side, the slope dropped sharply into a tangle of rocks and trees hundreds of feet below. On the other side, it fell away just as steeply into a gorge where a stream glinted faintly at the bottom. The trail itself was no more than 3 feet wide in most places, sometimes less, with loose gravel and jagged stones that tilted when weight pressed on them. I took a breath and tightened the straps of my pack. My hands were sweating, so I rubbed them against my shorts before starting forward. I kept my eyes on the trail and forced myself not to look too long at the drop on either side. My heart thudded heavier than the climb itself had caused. The ridge stretched on ahead, and the wind pressed harder against me now, steady and cold even in the summer heat. The first 100 yards went smoothly. My boots gripped well, and I planted each step carefully. I felt nervous, but I also felt alert in a way that sharpened every sense. The sound of pebbles sliding down the slope seemed loud, and the whistle of the wind in my ears seemed constant. My breathing came faster, but I kept moving steadily, telling myself that once I made it across, the trail would widen again and the rest would feel easy. But about halfway across, everything shifted. I had stepped on a flat piece of rock that seemed solid. The second I put my weight down, it tilted. My ankle rolled slightly, and gravel scattered under my boot. My body lurched to the left toward the gorge side, and my stomach dropped with it. Instinct made me throw my arms out, and my pack shifted heavily on my shoulders. For a moment, I thought I was gone. My foot scrambled, searching for something solid, and finally caught on another stone. I froze there, crouched low, my hands gripping the edge of the trail, breathing so fast I could hear each gulp of air over the wind. I forced myself not to look down. My eyes focused on the dirt in front of me, the tiny plants growing between cracks in the stone, the sharp line of the trail stretching forward. My whole body shook, but slowly, I pushed myself upright again. My ankle throbbed from the twist, but it held. I shifted my pack to balance it better, adjusted my stance, and took another step. The next 20 minutes dragged like hours. Each step felt like a test. Loose stones slid away under my boots, skittering down into nothingness. My knees ached from the way I bent them slightly to stay low and balanced. The sun felt hotter on my neck, and sweat stung my eyes. I wanted so badly to be off that ridge, but rushing would only make it worse. So I kept moving, slow and careful, counting each step in my head. Finally, I saw the trail widen again. The narrow ridge gave way to a broader stretch where small pines clung to the slope, and the ground spread out enough that I could stand without fear of tipping one way or the other. Relief flooded me so strongly I had to sit down. My legs shook uncontrollably, and I gulped water while staring at the ground, unwilling to look back at what I had crossed. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. The trail after the ridge sloped upward again, weaving between boulders and small clusters of trees. It wasn't dangerous, but my ankle hurt more with each step, and I realized I must have strained it worse than I first thought. I slowed down, testing my weight on it carefully. It wasn't broken, but the pain grew sharper when I stepped wrong, sending jolts up my leg. I considered turning back, but the idea of crossing that ridge again made my stomach twist. It felt safer to keep going forward and complete the loop. I pushed on. Hours slipped by. The sun climbed high overhead, and the heat settled heavy on my shoulders. My water level dropped faster than I liked. The higher sections of the trail were dry, with little shade, and I drained one of my bottles completely before noon. When I finally reached the point where the trail began to descend into the valley, I was more tired than I should have been, and the pain in my ankle was constant. The descent was steep and rough. The trail twisted sharply down switchbacks, with loose gravel that slid underfoot. I had to brace myself against trees more than once, feeling the strain in my arms as I caught my balance. My ankle screamed each time I landed on it too hard. I started to worry I wouldn't make it out before dark if I didn't keep a steady pace, but every step made that more difficult. Halfway down, clouds began to build. The breeze that had felt good on the ridge now carried a different edge, cooler and more forceful. I glanced up and saw gray spreading across the sky, swallowing the blue. Thunder rumbled faintly, so far away I thought I might have imagined it. But I knew storms in the mountains could come fast, and the last place I wanted to be was trapped on steep switchbacks with slick ground. I pushed harder, forcing myself down faster. My boots slid on loose stones, and more than once I caught myself from falling only by grabbing branches. My throat was dry, and I rationed my last half bottle of water carefully. The thunder grew louder. Lightning flickered in the distance, bright against the dark clouds. The valley floor was still far below, and the trail seemed endless. When the rain finally started, it came hard and sudden. Big drops splattered against the dirt, darkening it instantly. Then the sky opened, and water poured down in sheets. Within minutes, the trail turned slick, and mud clung to my boots. My clothes stuck to me, heavy and cold, and water ran down into my eyes, blinding me. I slipped once and landed hard on my hip, pain shooting through me. I sat there for a moment in the downpour, teeth clenched, then forced myself up again. The storm didn't let up. The switchbacks became small streams, water rushing over rocks and carrying pebbles with it. My boots squelched, sliding out from under me again and again. I slowed down, afraid that one bad fall would leave me unable to move at all. The trail felt like it stretched forever, each bend revealing only another stretch of wet stone and mud. By the time I reached the valley floor, the rain had softened, but everything was soaked. The ground squished with each step, and water dripped steadily from the trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and heavy. My ankle throbbed so badly I had to limp, and my hip ached from the fall. I checked my map under the dripping hood of my jacket, struggling to keep it dry enough to read. The loop back to the parking lot was still at least 4 miles. For miles through wet, muddy forest, with fading light and almost no water left. I kept going because there was no other choice. Each step was a battle between exhaustion, pain, and determination. My pack dug into my shoulders, my wet clothes chafed against my skin, and I decided to take the hike alone. I had been thinking about it for weeks, staring at maps, reading about trails, and trying to find the right time. Work had been heavy, and I felt myself sinking into the same routine every day. I wanted space, quiet, and something that would push me. The idea of hiking a long trail through the mountains and spending a few nights away from everything sounded perfect. The trail I picked was known for being remote. It wound its way up a large mountain ridge, dipped into valleys, and then rose again, with sections where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and the right gear. My backpack was heavy but balanced. I carried a tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra layers, first aid kit, and a map. I checked the weather again the morning I left. It showed clear skies and mild temperatures, with only a chance of light rain 2 days later. I reached the trailhead early. The parking area was mostly empty. The air felt crisp, and the forest at the edge of the lot looked thick and dark. I shouldered my pack, adjusted the straps, and started walking. The first part of the trail was wide and easy, a gradual incline with smooth dirt underfoot. My legs felt strong, and the air smelled of pine and damp soil. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The trail narrowed after the first mile. Roots and rocks made me watch my footing, and the trees pressed closer together. Sunlight broke through in patches, lighting the moss that grew thick on the trunks. I could hear birds and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I kept a steady pace, sweating a little under the weight of my pack but feeling good. By late morning, I reached a higher section where the trees thinned out. The trail climbed sharply, zigzagging up the slope, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. From a clearing, I could see far across the valley. The parking lot was hidden now, replaced by a vast stretch of green and the faint line of a river shining in the distance. It was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass. I pushed on, eating a snack while I walked. I tried to drink water steadily, knowing how easy it was to let dehydration sneak up. The trail grew steeper, and by early afternoon I was tired but satisfied with my progress. I reached a ridge where the ground flattened out for a while. The trail was less obvious here, just a faint path through rocks and short brush, marked every so often with small piles of stones. I slowed to make sure I stayed on course. At one point, I noticed a boot print in the dirt that looked fresh. It was a reminder that someone else had been here recently, though I hadn't seen another hiker all day. That comforted me slightly. As the afternoon went on, clouds began to form. They gathered fast, gray shapes building in the sky, and I felt a drop of cool air sweep down the ridge. I stopped to check my map and saw that there was a marked campsite a few miles ahead, near a small stream. I decided to push for it before the weather turned. The last stretch before the campsite was rough. The trail dipped into a hollow where fallen trees forced me to scramble over and around trunks. The ground was damp and slippery, and more than once I had to steady myself on roots to avoid falling. When I finally reached the stream, it was nearly dusk. The water ran clear and fast, and I knelt down to filter some into my bottles. The campsite was a small clearing among trees. There were flat spots for tents and the remains of old fire rings. I chose a spot close to the edge of the clearing where the ground was dry and level. Setting up the tent took me longer than usual since my hands felt clumsy from the long day. I got the poles up, stretched the rainfly over, and staked it down. I boiled water on my stove and made a simple meal. The forest grew darker around me, and I felt a deep quiet settle in. I kept glancing toward the trees, listening for movement, but heard nothing beyond the steady rush of the stream. When I finally lay down in my tent, I felt the relief of being off my feet. My body was sore, but my mind was restless. Every snap outside made me freeze. I tried to remind myself that the forest was full of harmless noises. Branches shifting, small animals moving, water trickling. Still, it took a long time to fall asleep. When I woke in the middle of the night, I didn't know why. The forest was silent. I lay on my back, staring into the dark, feeling my heart beating fast. The silence pressed in heavier than before. Then I heard it. The faint crunch of leaves came from somewhere near the clearing, slow and steady. My body tensed, every muscle stiff. The steps stopped, and I strained to hear more, but there was nothing. I lay awake for hours, drifting in and out, before morning light finally seeped through the tent. I packed quickly, eager to move. My legs felt heavy, but once I started walking, the stiffness faded. The trail climbed again, weaving between boulders and steep sections. The forest grew thinner as I went higher, and by midday I reached another ridge. The view was wide, stretching over rolling hills and jagged peaks. I stopped to eat and checked the map again. The next marked site was several miles away, past a section called Knife Ridge. The name alone made me cautious. The description said it was a narrow stretch with steep drop-offs on both sides. I didn't like the thought of crossing it in bad weather, but the sky had cleared again, bright and blue, so I decided to keep going. The approach to Knife Ridge was slow. The trail narrowed and the ground dropped sharply on either side. My pack felt heavier, every step deliberate. The ridge itself was worse than I imagined. The path was no wider than a few feet, loose gravel underfoot, and the wind hit me hard, threatening to push me sideways. I kept my eyes on the ground, moving one step at a time, refusing to look at the empty space to either side. My heart hammered in my chest. Halfway across, I heard rocks shift behind me. I froze, gripping my trekking pole, and turned. There was nothing but the trail stretching back, empty in the sunlight. But I knew what I'd heard, the sound of weight on gravel. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now, until I reached the end of the ridge and stumbled onto solid ground. I sat there for a while, catching my breath, staring back at the thin trail I had just crossed. The silence was deep again, only broken by the wind. By the time I reached the next campsite, I was drained. The site was small, tucked against a stand of tall pines, with only one flat spot big enough for a tent. I set up quickly, eager to rest, but that night the unease returned. Again, I woke to faint noises. This time it was the sound of branches snapping, closer than before. I lay still, gripping the knife I kept near my sleeping bag, and waited. The noises stopped after a while, leaving me wide awake and cold with sweat. Morning brought relief, but also the growing sense that I was not alone. I tried to tell myself it was wildlife, deer, maybe a bear, but something about the pattern of sounds didn't fit. They came in slow steps, almost careful, as if someone was trying not to be heard. I packed and moved again, faster now. The trail grew rougher, climbing higher into rocky ground where trees grew sparse. The air was thinner, cooler, and I could see for miles. That should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel exposed. At one point I thought I saw movement on the trail far behind me, just a quick flash of something dark before it vanished into the trees. I stopped, staring, but saw nothing more. The day dragged on. My body ached, and I could feel blisters forming on my feet. I forced myself to keep drinking water, to keep eating, though my appetite was gone. The sense of being watched grew stronger, a weight pressing at the back of my neck. Every time I turned, the trail was empty. That night, I didn't set up camp in a marked site. I chose a hidden spot off the trail, hoping that being less visible would ease my nerves. I cleared leaves, pitched my tent quickly, and cooked in silence. Darkness fell heavy. I crawled inside and tried to calm myself, but when the noises started again, I knew it wasn't chance. This time I heard breathing, slow, steady, just outside the thin wall of the tent. I held my breath, every muscle locked. The breathing stayed for what felt like minutes, then faded into the forest. I didn't move until the first light of dawn. I broke camp in silence and started down the trail, moving as fast as I could. My pack felt unbearable now, but I refused to stop. The map showed that the trail would begin descending after another ridge, eventually leading back toward a lower valley. My only thought was to reach it, to get out, to see people again. As the day went on, the sense of pursuit became undeniable. I heard rocks shift behind me more than once. At one point, I saw a figure at the edge of the trees. A brief shape, tall and human, before it stepped back out of sight. My stomach turned to ice. I pushed harder, nearly running in places, stumbling over roots, scraping my hands on rocks. The trail wound endlessly, switchback after switchback, and my legs shook with exhaustion. By late afternoon, I was gasping for I always liked the idea of hiking alone. It gave me a kind of quiet I couldn't find in town. I could move at my own pace, stop when I wanted, eat when I wanted, and just be in the woods without hearing anyone's voice. But looking back now, I realized that what started as a simple plan for a long weekend hike turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to push myself by trying a longer trail. The plan was a 3-day loop that went deep into a mountain range about 2 hours from where I lived. It wasn't completely off the grid, but once you were a few miles in, you wouldn't see many people, especially on weekdays. I figured I'd go light, pack enough food, and just take it slow. I read about the trail, looked at maps, and saw some warnings about rough sections, steep drops, and wildlife, but nothing too alarming. I thought I was ready. The first morning was calm. The sky was gray, and there was a light mist in the air. I parked my car in a small gravel lot by the trailhead, signed the register, and strapped on my pack. The first miles were easy. The trail followed a river, and I could hear the water rushing to my left. The smell of wet earth and pine needles hung in the air. It felt good to move, and I was excited for what was ahead. After about 2 hours, the trail started to climb. It wasn't too steep, but it was steady, and the mist turned into a light rain. My shirt clung to my back, and my boots grew heavy with mud. The forest felt thicker as I climbed, with trees leaning over the path and rocks slick with water. I passed one small clearing where someone had camped before, a black ring of burned logs in the dirt, but otherwise it felt empty. I kept going until early afternoon. I stopped under some trees to eat a sandwich, listening to the rain tap on the leaves above me. It was peaceful, though I couldn't shake the thought of how far I was from anyone. When the wind blew through the trees, the sound of branches creaking felt almost too loud. By evening, I reached a ridge where I planned to camp. It was an open spot with a view of the valley below, though clouds had rolled in and blocked most of it. I set up my tent quickly, boiled some noodles, and sat in the damp air while the light faded. My phone had no signal, which I expected, but it still made me feel cut off. As night fell, the rain picked up again, and I crawled into my tent, listening to the steady pounding on the fabric. I fell asleep to that sound, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard a faint crunch of footsteps outside. My chest tightened. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal running. It sounded like something moving carefully, one step at a time. I told myself it could be deer, maybe even a bear. My food was sealed and hung in a bag from a tree a good distance away, so I hoped it wouldn't be interested. Still, lying there in the dark with thin tent walls around me, every sound seemed closer than it probably was. After a long time, the steps faded, and I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked. I packed up quickly and started on the next section of the trail, which went deeper into the range. The trail was harder now. Steeper climbs, narrow switchbacks, and sections where the path was crumbling at the edge. I had to focus on every step, especially with the mud. By midday, the sky cleared a little, and I could finally see some of the mountains around me. They looked endless, layers of dark ridges fading into the distance. It gave me a strange mix of awe and unease. Being out there alone, surrounded by so much space, made me feel smaller than I expected. In the afternoon, I reached a section where the trail crossed a landslide area. The path was just a strip of dirt across a steep slope, with loose rocks above and below. I moved slowly, testing each step, gripping my trekking pole hard. Halfway across, a rock slid under my foot, and I dropped to one knee. Gravel skidded down the slope into the trees far below. My heart pounded as I steadied myself, forcing myself to keep moving until I reached solid ground. When I finally got across, I sat on a log, breathing hard. I realized then how dangerous this hike could really be. If I fell or twisted an ankle, no one would know. I hadn't seen another person since yesterday morning. The quiet that once felt peaceful now felt heavy. That evening, I camped in a small flat spot by a stream. I washed my face and hands in the cold water, cooked rice, and tried to relax. But as night came, the forest grew restless. I heard rustling in the undergrowth, splashes in the stream, and the distant crack of branches. Every noise made me sit up, straining to listen. Again, I thought I heard footsteps close to my camp. Slow, uneven steps. My stomach turned, but when I shined my headlamp out, I saw nothing but trees. I barely slept that night. On the third day, I was supposed to loop back toward the starting point. The trail forked, and I took the left path that led back toward the valley. This section was overgrown, and in some places, I could barely see the trail. Branches slapped against my arms, and thorny vines caught on my pack. The ground was uneven, and more than once I slipped in the mud. Around noon, the trail descended into a narrow gorge. The walls rose steep on both sides, and the path followed a small stream. It was darker here, and the air felt colder. The sound of dripping water echoed off the rocks. I felt trapped in that space with no open view ahead or behind. Halfway through the gorge, I noticed something that made me stop. In the mud ahead, I saw footprints. Human footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the wet ground, heading the same way I was going. At first, I thought maybe another hiker was ahead of me, but the prints looked uneven, as if the person had been limping or dragging one foot. A chill ran through me. I hadn't seen anyone in days. For someone to be ahead of me now, moving strangely in this isolated place, felt wrong. I followed slowly, my eyes scanning the trees and rocks around me. The prints continued for a while, then vanished where the ground turned rocky. I kept moving, but my nerves were shot. Every shadow looked like it was hiding someone. I moved faster, wanting out of that gorge, wanting back to open ground. When I finally climbed out, the sun was low, and I knew I had to stop for the night soon. I found a small clearing and set up my tent, though I barely felt safe. My hands shook as I boiled water for food. The silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind. That night was the worst. I lay awake in my tent, clutching my flashlight, my ears tuned to every sound. Hours passed in a blur of fear. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the outside of my tent. Not an animal snuffling, but a faint drag, like a hand or a piece of cloth sliding over the fabric. My throat tightened, and I froze, afraid to move. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I packed up in a rush. My only goal was to get out. The trail was supposed to loop back to the main path, but somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The markers grew scarce, and soon I realized I wasn't sure where I was. Panic started to set in. My map didn't match what I was seeing. The terrain was rougher, and the trail looked less maintained, almost abandoned. I kept moving, hoping it would rejoin the main loop, but instead, it led me deeper into thick forest. By afternoon, I was exhausted, my legs sore, my throat dry. My water filter was still working, but my food was running low. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I'd stopped to catch my breath, and behind me, I thought I heard faint movement, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But whenever I turned, there was nothing. Finally, as evening fell, I stumbled onto an old dirt road. Relief flooded me. I didn't know where it led, but it was wide and clear, easier to follow than the narrow trails. I decided to camp just off the road, telling myself I'd follow it in the morning. That night, I built a small fire for the first time. The smoke curled into the dark, and I sat close to the flames, clutching my knife. The woods felt too quiet, as if everything was holding its breath. My nerves were so frayed I jumped at the crack of a log shifting in the fire. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, uneven, coming down the dirt road. My chest seized, and I held my breath. The steps grew louder, closer, then stopped. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, but I saw nothing. The silence stretched on and on. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack, stamped out the fire, and moved deeper into the trees, setting up my tent far from the road. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the dark, knife in hand, heart racing. When the sky finally lightened, I forced myself back onto the road. I followed it for hours, my legs shaking. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for months. I had read about people walking into the mountains alone, staying away from cities and roads, and I wanted that same kind of experience. I wanted to be out there by myself, where it was quiet and where I could push myself to go farther than I thought I could. I picked a section of trail that wound through the mountains, not the most popular part, but still marked on maps and written about in guidebooks. The plan was to spend 3 nights out there, moving from one campsite to another, carrying everything I needed in my pack. The morning I set out was bright and cool. The parking lot at the trailhead was empty when I pulled in. My car was the only one there, which gave me a strange feeling, but I told myself that was what I wanted. I didn't want crowds. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be far away. I strapped on my pack and started up the trail. It was steep from the very beginning, a long climb through the trees with roots twisting across the dirt. The sound of traffic from the highway faded quickly until all I heard was my boots hitting the ground and my own breathing. The deeper I went into the woods, the more it felt like I had stepped into another world. The air smelled sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. The trail wound higher until the trees thinned, and I could see the valley below. My car was a tiny shape in the lot, far away now. I thought about how no one would know exactly where I was at this moment. I had told people roughly, but not in detail. It gave me a small shiver, but also a thrill. I was completely on my own. By midday, the sun was high, and I had made good distance. I stopped at a small creek, filled my bottle, and ate some food. The water was icy cold, and it made my teeth ache when I drank it. Afterward, I shouldered my pack again and kept moving. The forest grew darker as clouds gathered, covering the sun. The air grew heavy, and soon a light rain began to fall. I pulled out my rain jacket and kept walking, but the rocks grew slick, and the ground was soft. My boots sank slightly into the mud with each step. The trail climbed higher into rougher terrain. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the woods were dripping. Everything smelled wet and earthy. I reached a flat clearing marked on my map as a camping spot. It was nothing more than a flat patch of dirt under tall trees, but it looked good enough. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and got a small fire going with some dry wood I found under logs. That first night was quiet. I lay in my tent, listening to the rain drip from the trees, feeling both nervous and excited. Every little sound outside made me alert. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, but it was always nothing. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next day, I packed up and moved deeper into the mountains. The trail became narrower and less clear. There were sections where it was overgrown with brush, and I had to push my way through. Other parts were steep and rocky, where I had to use my hands to steady myself. Hours passed, and I barely saw any signs of other hikers. No boot prints in the mud, no fresh trash or broken branches. Felt like no one had been here for a long time. Around mid-afternoon, I was climbing a steep switchback when I saw something strange. A single boot print pressed into the dirt, but it was old, dried out, and half-washed by rain. The tread was deep, the kind made by heavy boots. I stopped and stared at it, wondering who had been here and how long ago. It was the first sign I had seen of another person on the trail. I kept climbing, but now I was more aware of my surroundings. I looked back often, scanning the trail below me. The woods felt thicker, darker. By the time I reached the second marked campsite on my map, I was tired and sore. The site was small, just enough space to pitch a tent beside a cluster of large boulders. I dropped my pack and set up again. As the evening light faded, I gathered wood, started a small fire, and ate. That night was different. As I lay in my tent, I heard noises out in the dark. first, I thought it was just animals, deer moving through the brush, maybe. But then I heard something heavier. A steady, slow crunch of footsteps on dirt. Not the quick darting of an animal, but a steady, careful pace. I froze in my sleeping bag, listening. The sound stopped. Then, after a long pause, it started again. Closer this time. I held my breath and gripped the handle of the small knife I kept in the side pocket of my bag. The footsteps moved around my campsite, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything through the walls of my tent, but I felt exposed like whoever or whatever. It knew exactly where I was. After what felt like hours, the sound faded into the trees. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my ears straining for the smallest noise. When dawn finally came, I crawled out of my tent, exhausted and shaky. The woods were quiet again, the air cold and misty. I walked around the campsite, searching the ground. First, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the fire pit, I saw them boot prints. Fresh ones. They circled the site in a wide loop, close to my tent, then trailed off into the trees. They weren't mine. I felt my stomach twist. I had not seen anyone all day on the trail, and the only print I had seen before was old and half-washed. But these were new. Someone had been here, walking around my camp in the dark while I was inside my tent. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. I told myself I'd finish the hike early, maybe turn back to the trailhead. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail climbed higher over a ridge and then dropped into another valley. It grew narrower and harder to follow. At one point, I lost it entirely and had to backtrack, searching for the markers carved into trees. Late in the day, I reached another flat spot where the map showed a camp. I didn't want to stop, but my legs ached, and the light was fading fast. I set up quickly, ate without building a fire, and got into my tent. That night was worse. It started the same way, small sounds in the distance, twigs snapping. Then the footsteps again, slow, steady, circling. This time, they came closer. I heard the crunch of dirt just feet away from my tent. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The footsteps paused. Then I heard the faintest sound, like fabric brushing against fabric, as if someone had shifted their weight in heavy clothes. I lay there for hours, frozen, until the sound finally faded again. In the morning, I stepped outside and found more prints. Clearer this time, deep boot marks leading right up to the edge of my tent. Panic surged through me. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They knew I was here. They had been coming closer each night. I made the decision then. I was done. I wasn't going deeper. I was going to turn back, retrace my steps, and get out. I packed fast, barely eating. I shoved everything into my pack, shouldered it, and started back the way I had come. The trail looked different now. Every shadow felt threatening. Every sound made me stop and listen. I checked behind me constantly, convinced I'd see someone there. Hours passed, and my nerves frayed. The silence of the woods felt heavier than ever. By late afternoon, I was nearing the first campsite I had stayed at, the one near the creek. I considered stopping, but fear pushed me on. I didn't want to spend another night out here. I wanted the car, the road, the world outside these woods. But the trail was long, and darkness caught me before I reached the end. I had no choice but to stop. I pitched my tent in a small clearing off the trail, not at the marked site, hoping maybe I'd be harder to find. I didn't build a fire. I ate cold food in the dark and zipped myself inside. That night, the footsteps came again. They were louder now, bolder. They moved directly around my tent, slow and steady. At one point, I heard the faint sound of breathing, deep and heavy, just outside the thin fabric wall. I gripped my knife, sweat soaking my palms. I wanted to run, but where would I go in the dark? I stayed still, every muscle tight, listening as the steps circled again and again. Then silence. I didn't sleep. At first light, I tore down my tent, shoved it into my pack, and started down the trail at a near run. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. The last miles felt endless. Every bend, I expected to see someone waiting. but the trail stayed empty. Finally, I saw the parking lot through the trees. My car was still there, exactly where I left it. I stumbled toward it, heart pounding, unlocked the door, and threw my pack inside. As I drove away, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. But the road stayed empty behind me. I never saw a face. I never heard a voice. I don't know who it was or why they were out there, but I know what I heard, what I saw pressed into the dirt around my tent. And I know I'll never go back there again. I have always liked hiking alone. There is something about being deep in the woods with nothing but my thoughts, the sound of birds, and the steady rhythm of my boots that feels grounding. I often plan weekend trips when I have free time, carrying just the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a small first aid kit. It had always been refreshing, a way to clear my mind. I thought I was careful enough. I checked maps, weather reports, and made sure my gear was ready. But one trip in the late summer of 2019 nearly changed everything for me. The hike I chose wasn't anything extreme. It was supposed to be a simple loop through a large forested area with rolling hills, streams, and some ridges. The total loop was about 18 miles. My plan was to hike around 10 miles the first day, camp overnight, and finish the rest in the morning. The weather forecast was clear, the trail map looked simple, and I felt confident. I had done longer hikes before, so I didn't expect much trouble. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead around noon. The air was warm but not too hot. The sky was a pale blue with only a few thin clouds drifting lazily. I remember tightening the straps of my pack, locking the car, and telling myself I'd be back by tomorrow afternoon. There were no other cars in the lot, which didn't bother me. I like solitude. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail wound through tall trees that let only thin strips of sunlight cut through. Dry leaves and twigs crunched under my boots, and every so often I would hear a woodpecker tapping somewhere in the distance. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and I felt calm. The forest seemed endless, but in a way that felt safe. As the day went on, I made steady progress. I passed a shallow stream where I refilled my water, then climbed up a ridge that gave me a wide view of rolling hills stretching out in every direction. The trees swayed lightly in the breeze, and for a moment I just stood there breathing in the air, enjoying how far away I was from roads, noise, and people. I kept moving, and by the time the sun started to drop lower, I had covered close to 10 miles. I found a flat area not far off the trail that looked perfect for camp. It was surrounded by trees on 3 sides, with just enough open space to set my small tent. The ground was soft with fallen leaves. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and started setting up. I boiled water for a simple meal, ate, and then sat watching the light fade between the trees. The forest was alive with sounds. Crickets starting up, the occasional rustle of something in the undergrowth, and the distant hoot of an owl. By the time the sky turned dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the chill in the air, or maybe a sound outside. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, but not silent. Leaves shifted now and then, and I could hear faint movements, the kind small animals make when they scurry around. Nothing unusual. I closed my eyes again, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke with the sun filtering faintly through the fabric of the tent. I felt stiff but rested. I packed everything up, ate a quick breakfast, and shouldered my pack again. The plan was simple: follow the loop back to the parking lot. It should have taken me maybe 5 or 6 hours at most. I started walking, and for a while everything felt normal. The trail dipped down into a hollow, then curved around toward another ridge. The air was cool and damp, with dew clinging to the leaves. Birds sang overhead, but after an hour or so, something felt off. The trail seemed less distinct. The dirt path I had been following grew narrower, with more roots and brush across it. I slowed down, checked the map in my pack, and tried to match it to where I thought I was. The trouble was, the map wasn't detailed enough to show every little bend. I assumed I was still on track. Another half hour passed, and the trail became even harder to read. I reached a fork I didn't remember seeing the day before. One path dipped sharply downhill, the other veered off into thicker woods. There were no markers nailed to trees, no paint blazes, nothing. I stood there for a while, confused. I pulled out the map again, turning it in my hands, trying to figure out which direction I should go. Neither option looked right. I decided to go downhill, thinking it might lead me to the stream I had crossed earlier. Streams are good landmarks, and if I found it, I could reorient myself. The trail downhill was steep and slippery, and it narrowed until it was barely more than a game path. After 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of water. My gut tightened. I stopped, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and forced myself to stay calm. I turned around to go back up the slope, but when I reached the fork again, something didn't look right. The path I had come from didn't look the same. It twisted off differently, and the ground seemed more uneven. My chest felt heavy. I walked in the direction I thought was right, but after 15 minutes, nothing seemed familiar. I knew then that I had gone off the main loop. I was officially lost. At first, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I still had plenty of daylight, food, and water. I had a compass clipped to my pack, and I knew the general direction the parking lot should be. If I just kept steady, I'd eventually hit a road or another trail. But the forest has a way of twisting around you. The more I walked, the more everything looked the same. Endless trees, uneven ground, patches of brush. I tried following the compass, but each hill and valley forced me to curve around, and soon I wasn't even sure I was going in the same line. By late afternoon, I was sweating hard, my legs aching, and I still had no idea where I was. My water bottle was half empty. I sat on a log, pulled off my pack, and tried to calm my breathing. The woods were quiet, too quiet now. I hadn't seen any other hikers. I hadn't even heard distant traffic or planes overhead. Just stillness, broken by the occasional snap of a twig. I thought about setting up camp again and trying in the morning, but a kind of unease gnawed at me. I hated the idea of being out here without knowing where I was. I kept moving, even though I knew I was wearing myself down. The sun sank low, and shadows stretched long between the trees. The air cooled quickly. I realized I wasn't going to make it out before dark. I reluctantly searched for another flat spot to set up camp. I found one in a small clearing, though it didn't feel nearly as comfortable as the first. The ground was uneven, and I had to clear branches before putting up the tent. I boiled what little water I had left with some dried food, ate without tasting it, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the darkness closed in. That night was different. I kept waking up, startled by sounds outside. Branches snapping, footsteps, or what I thought were footsteps, circling at a distance. My heart would pound, but each time I told myself it was just animals. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, I sat up and unzipped the tent slightly to peek out. The forest was black, with only vague shapes of trees against the darker sky. I didn't see anything, but the silence pressed down on me. I finally forced myself to lie back down, though sleep came only in short bursts. When morning came, I felt drained. My water was almost gone, and my map was useless now. I decided to keep heading east, trusting the compass. At least that way I was doing something. I stumbled on, pushing through brush, climbing over logs, and ducking under branches. The forest seemed endless. Hours passed, and I grew thirstier, my throat dry, my head heavy. At one point, I thought I heard running water and pushed toward the sound. After struggling down a slope, I found a narrow stream trickling over rocks. Relief washed over me. I dropped to my knees, filled my bottle, and drank deeply after filtering it. The cold water revived me, though only slightly. I followed the stream for a while, thinking it might lead to a larger river or even civilization. But the stream meandered endlessly, cutting deeper into thick woods. By late afternoon, I realized I was walking in circles. I recognized a fallen tree I had already passed hours before. The realization hit me hard, and I had to sit down. My chest tightened, and I fought against panic. I told myself to breathe, to keep calm. I still had supplies, though they were running low. I still had energy, though it was fading. That night, I camped again, this time near the stream. I was too exhausted to eat much. I sat in the dark, listening to the forest, every sound amplified. Something crashed through the brush at one point, too big for a squirrel, maybe a deer. But my nerves were raw, and I clutched the small knife I carried, sitting tense until the sounds faded. Sleep was thin, filled with uneasy dreams. The next day blurred together. More walking, more endless trees. My food was nearly gone. My body ached, blisters burned on my feet, and every step felt heavier. I never thought much about hiking alone until I actually did it. It was supposed to be something small, a simple challenge I set for myself after years of always going with friends or family. I had been hiking on and off for most of my 20s, mostly short-day hikes and weekend trips. I liked the idea of pushing myself to go a little farther, staying out in the woods overnight, and testing what I could handle on my own. I wasn't careless, but I wasn't paranoid either. I figured that if I picked a marked trail, carried the right supplies, and kept my head clear, I would be fine. I picked a loop trail in a mountain region I had only driven past before but never explored. The information I found online said the loop was about 20 miles long, usually done in 2 days, sometimes stretched to 3 if you took it slow. The terrain looked manageable. The photos showed narrow paths that twisted along ridges, thick woods that gave some shade, and small streams where you could refill water. There were a couple of camping spots marked on the map. It seemed like exactly the kind of hike I wanted. Quiet, challenging enough to make me feel accomplished, but not so risky that I would be biting off more than I could chew. I set out in the late morning. My pack was heavier than I liked, but I carried the usual tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, food, first aid kit, headlamp, extra clothes. The trail started out wide and clear. For the first mile or two, I passed a few other people, day hikers mostly. After that, the traffic dropped off. By the time I hit the first ridge, I realized I was completely alone. I didn't mind. That was part of the plan. The trail narrowed as it climbed. The air was dry and warm, with that dusty pine smell you only get when the sun heats the needles on the forest floor. My boots scuffed through loose dirt and small rocks, and sometimes I had to watch my balance because the trail hugged the side of a steep drop. The view opened now and then, showing tree-covered valleys and sharp cliffs. I told myself not to look down too much, but I always did. The slope fell hundreds of feet, with nothing but trees and jagged stone below. It made me careful with every step. By late afternoon, I reached a flat clearing where I planned to set up camp. The ground was hard but clear of roots, and there was a small fire ring made of stones. Someone else had camped there before. I pitched my tent, boiled some noodles, and ate while the sky turned orange. The silence was heavier than I expected. I could hear only small noises, the wind moving through the branches, a few birds, the snapping of twigs as night animals began to stir. When darkness finally settled, I crawled into my tent. My body was tired but restless. I shifted in my sleeping bag, listening to every sound. Out here, even normal noises felt sharp. A branch cracking in the distance made my heart jump. I forced myself to breathe slow, reminding myself that animals avoided humans, that I was safe. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke before the sun came up. The sky was pale gray, and the air was colder than I expected. My breath fogged as I packed up camp and forced down a quick breakfast bar. The trail ahead was supposed to climb another ridge, then drop into a valley before circling back toward the start. I figured I could finish the loop by late afternoon if I kept a steady pace. The climb was harder that second day. The trail tilted sharply upward, and loose gravel slid under my boots. My legs burned, and sweat stung my eyes. The forest grew denser, the trees closer together, blocking out the wind. I kept moving, stopping only to drink and catch my breath. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The trail looked narrower than the map had shown. The dirt path was no wider than my boots, carved into the side of the mountain. To my right, the slope rose sharply, covered in trees and boulders. To my left, The ground dropped away into nothing. There was no railing, no trees to grab if I slipped, just open air and a deadly fall. I kept moving carefully, planting each step with focus. The silence was deeper here, almost suffocating. No birds, no rustle of small animals. Only the sound of my boots scraping the dirt. Then I heard something else. It was faint at first, just a light slide of rocks somewhere above me. I froze and looked up. The slope rose steep and jagged, dotted with trees. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just a squirrel or a loose rock settling in place. I kept walking, but a few minutes later, it came again. A faint crunch of gravel, this time closer. I stopped again, heart pounding. The slope above me looked empty. I tried to brush it off. Paranoia could creep in easily when you were alone. Every sound became sharper. Every shadow seemed deeper. I kept going, forcing my eyes on the trail. The path grew steeper, clinging tighter to the cliffside. My pack felt heavier with every step. I shifted my weight forward to stay balanced. My boots slipped once on loose dirt, and I had to throw a hand against the rock wall to steady myself. For a moment, I imagined my body tumbling down the cliff, crashing through trees, bones breaking, bag straps tangling around me. The image made me stop and take a deep breath. That was when I heard it again, louder this time. Gravel and small stones sliding down from above. I jerked my head up. A few loose pebbles bounced past me, clicking against the trail before dropping off the edge. I scanned the slope, my stomach turning. Still nothing. No movement, no animals. Just silent trees and stone. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. I pushed forward. Faster now, my breath coming harder. The trail wound around a bend, and for a brief moment, I had to step over a gap where part of the path had crumbled away. The dirt gave a little under my boot, and I nearly lost my balance. My hands scraped against the wall as I pulled myself across. My chest was tight with fear. When I finally reached a wider section of trail, I stopped to rest. I set my pack down and crouched, trying to calm my breathing. My ears strained for sounds. Nothing. But then I saw something that made my stomach sink. In the dust of the trail behind me, back where the narrow section had been, there were prints. Not boot prints like mine, but bare feet. The toes were clear in the dirt, wide apart. The arches pressed deep as if whoever it was had been carrying weight. I stared at them for a long time. The prints were fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or time. Someone had been walking the trail barefoot, and not long ago. I felt a heavy wave of dread. No one sensible hiked this terrain without shoes. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Sharp rocks, thorns, uneven ground. Whoever it was, they were either reckless or desperate. I swallowed hard, picked up my pack, and kept moving. The trail began to dip, winding downward into the valley. The air grew damper, and patches of moss clung to rocks. I passed through stretches of dense forest where the canopy blocked most of the light. Shadows stretched long across the path. Every now and then I glanced back. My eyes searched the trail behind me, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me. My skin prickled, and every sound made me jump. By late afternoon, I reached a flat spot near a stream where I could refill water. My legs ached, and I knew I needed to stop for the night. I set up camp quickly, my hands moving faster than usual. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. As darkness fell, the woods closed in around me. I sat by my small stove, eating in silence. My headlamp beam shook as I turned it from tree to tree, searching for movement. Nothing. But when I finally lay down in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling. I heard faint noises in the night, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Every time I held my breath and listened, the sound stopped. I barely slept. When the gray light of dawn came, I packed up fast. My body was stiff, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. I wanted to finish the loop as quickly as possible and get out of the woods. The trail narrowed again as it climbed out of the valley. The prints appeared once more in the dirt ahead of me. Bare feet, always bare feet. They wove along the trail, sometimes vanishing where the ground turned to stone, then appearing again in patches of dust. I moved faster, my chest tight. I couldn't stop picturing someone just out of sight, slipping through the trees, watching me, waiting. By midday, the trail opened onto another ridge. From there, I could see the valley stretching far below, the trees like dark green waves. The sky was clear, but I barely noticed. My focus was on the trail ahead. That was when I heard it again, the scrape of stone, closer than ever. I turned quickly, heart hammering. First, I saw nothing. Then, between two trees higher up the slope, I caught movement. A figure, thin and pale, slipping back into the shadows. My whole body went cold. I didn't wait. I pushed forward, almost jogging now, stumbling on loose rocks, catching myself with my hands. The trail twisted, dipped, and climbed again, but I barely... I had been planning that hike for months. It was not supposed to be anything extreme. Just a few days alone in the mountains, a chance to clear my head, push myself a little, and get away from the noise of daily life. I had been hiking for years, mostly local trails and weekend trips, and I thought I knew enough to take on something bigger. The plan was to start early in the morning, climb up along a long ridge trail, spend the night at a small campsite I had marked on my map, and then cut across a different route back to where I had parked. It looked simple enough on paper. When I started out, everything felt perfect. The air was cool, the trail was quiet, and I carried just enough gear to keep me moving fast but safe. My pack had water, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a small stove. I had checked the weather report the night before, and it promised clear skies. The first few miles passed easily. The trail wound through forest, the smell of pine and damp soil all around me, birds darting across the branches above. The climb was steady but not too hard, and I felt my legs settling into the rhythm of it. As the morning stretched on, the forest grew thinner. The trees pulled back and the trail climbed into open ground where the sun hit harder. The silence was deeper there, just the crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional whistle of wind through the grass. By midday, I had reached a point high above the valley, and I stopped to rest. I pulled out a snack, drank water, and looked down over the endless trees. The world felt far away. That was what I had wanted. I continued on, expecting to reach my campsite before dusk. But the trail began to change. The path that had been clear at first grew narrower and rockier. It bent around steep slopes, loose gravel shifting under each step. At times, I had to steady myself with my hands as I scrambled up short rises. My pack pressed heavy against my back. The higher I went, the more I realized how isolated I was. The idea thrilled me at first, but as shadows lengthened, that thrill began to feel different. I checked my map several times. The paper showed a clear line where the trail should be, but the ground under my boots didn't always match. Sometimes I thought I had lost it completely, only to see a faint sign. An old blaze on a tree, a pile of stones, a worn patch of earth that told me I was still going the right way. I pushed on, slower now, always glancing at the sun as it sank lower behind the ridges. When I finally reached the spot I had planned to camp, I was more tired than I had expected. The clearing was smaller than I thought it would be, barely enough room to set up my tent. It sat on the edge of a slope that fell away sharply into thick woods. I pitched my tent quickly, boiled water for a meal, and ate while sitting on a rock, staring out at the last light fading. Everything felt quiet, too quiet. The wind had died and the forest seemed to be holding its breath. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap shut, and lay back. My body ached, but I couldn't relax. Every sound outside seemed sharper. The crack of a branch, the scuffle of something in the brush, the far-off call of some unseen animal. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal noises of the woods at night. But sleep came only in short, broken stretches. I woke again and again, staring into the dark fabric of the tent, listening. By dawn, I was already awake, my nerves stretched thin. I packed quickly and started back down. But as I moved, I realized something was wrong. The trail that had been clear enough yesterday looked different in the pale morning light. I followed what I thought was the right path, but it ended suddenly at a wall of brush. I turned back, tried another way, and that ended at a slope too steep to climb. My map looked simple, but the land around me did not match. Hours passed as I circled, searching for the real trail. My water was running low. The sun grew hotter and my legs heavier. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that if I kept moving downhill, I would eventually reach a road or a stream. But the ground below was tangled forest, thick and endless, with ridges that forced me in circles. By afternoon, I was completely lost. My throat was dry, my food nearly gone. I stumbled down a gully, hoping to find water, but the rocks there were bone dry. Sweat stung my eyes. My legs shook with each step. I kept telling myself that people survived worse, that I just had to keep moving. But the fear inside me grew. That night, I didn't bother with the tent. I spread my bag on the ground and lay awake again, staring at the stars through the trees. Every rustle in the dark set my nerves on edge. Hunger twisted in my stomach, and thirst burned in my throat. I thought of home, of my family, of the simple safety of four walls. I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. The next day, I forced myself up and kept walking. My pace slowed to a crawl. The forest pressed in on me, endless and unchanging. At times, I thought I heard water, only to find it was the wind moving through leaves. My lips cracked, my head pounded. I tried not to panic, but it was already there, running deep under every thought. Late in the day, I finally found a trickle of water running down a rock face. I dropped to my knees and drank greedily, ignoring the dirt and leaves floating in it. The cold water filled me with a surge of hope, but it faded quickly. I still had no idea where I was. I kept moving, but my strength was failing. The pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My steps dragged. At times I thought about just lying down and stopping, but the thought of never being found pushed me back up each time. I started marking trees with a knife, hoping it would help me track where I had been. But after a while, the marks blurred together and I couldn't tell anymore. Days passed like that, a blur of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. My food was gone. I chewed on leaves, sucked on small twigs just to keep my mouth busy. My body grew weaker with every mile. My mind began to fade in and out. Sometimes I walked for hours without knowing where I was going. Sometimes I sat and stared at nothing. On the 5th day, I stumbled out of the trees onto a wide stretch of rocks. My legs nearly gave out as I saw what lay beyond. A thin dirt road winding along the edge of the woods. I dragged myself toward it, my body shaking. I collapsed on the roadside, too weak to move further, and lay there as the sun burned overhead. It was hours before I heard the sound of an engine. A truck appeared around the bend, slowed, and stopped. I was too weak to stand, too weak even to raise my hand. But the driver saw me. The door slammed and footsteps rushed toward me. The last thing I remember was the feel of strong hands lifting me, the sound of a voice I could barely make out, and the smell of gasoline and dust. Then everything went black. When I woke again, I was in a hospital bed. My body was thin and weak, my lips split, my skin burned by the sun. A nurse checked my pulse and whispered something to someone else. I had been found just in time. The hike I had thought would be a simple escape had nearly killed me. I had underestimated the land, overestimated myself, and ignored the signs when things began to go wrong. I learned the hard way that the wilderness doesn't care about plans or confidence. It is bigger than that, stronger than that, and if you make a mistake, it will not forgive you easily. I survived, but I carry the weight of those days with me still. The silence of the woods, the endless hunger, the fear that pressed close every night. I don't hike alone anymore, and when I step onto a trail, I never forget how quickly the ground can turn against you. I had been hiking for years, but I had always kept myself on marked trails, loops, and easy-to-follow routes. I liked maps, signs, and trail markers because they gave me a sense of order and safety. But that summer, I wanted to push myself further. I wanted to try something that felt more challenging, something that took me off the well-traveled paths and into the parts of the woods where fewer people went. I had read about an old, abandoned fire lookout that was no longer in use, deep in a stretch of forest that wasn't maintained much anymore. The only way to reach it was by following an old service trail that had mostly been erased by time. Some hikers online said they had made the trip, though they warned that the trail was difficult, overgrown, and easy to lose. It wasn't technically forbidden, but it was the sort of hike where you had to be responsible for yourself because no one was coming to help if you got into trouble. That idea both scared me and pulled me in. I spent weeks preparing, reading trip reports, checking maps, and gathering supplies. I packed everything carefully. My backpack had water, food, a first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, a knife, a whistle, my phone, a power bank, and even a paper map with a compass. I thought I was ready for anything. The morning of the hike, I drove out to the trailhead, which was already in a pretty remote area. The road itself had been long and winding, with no cell service for miles. I parked near a faded wooden sign that marked the start of the main trail. From there, it was supposed to be about 4 miles on the normal path before turning off onto the overgrown service route. The first part of the hike was easy. The trail was wide, shaded by tall pines and firs, with sunlight breaking through in narrow beams. Birds called overhead, and the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. My boots crunched steadily on the dirt, and I felt good, confident, even excited. I passed no other hikers that morning. It was early, and this trail wasn't a popular one, so I wasn't surprised. After about an hour, I reached the point where I needed to turn off. There wasn't an official sign, just a faint marker scratched into a tree, almost hidden by moss. The ground here looked less walked on, but I could just barely make out a narrow track leading into thicker woods. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto it. The difference was immediate. The trail was uneven, cluttered with fallen branches, and in some places the undergrowth grew so thick that I had to push through it. Ferns brushed against my legs, and thorny vines snagged at my sleeves. I had to keep my eyes on the ground constantly to avoid tripping over hidden roots and rocks. After another mile or so, the trail became even harder to follow. Sections disappeared entirely, replaced by what looked like animal tracks or simply empty forest floor. I relied on the faint direction I knew I needed to go, northwest, and tried to keep myself oriented with the compass. Every now and then, I spotted an old marker nailed into a tree, so faded that it was almost invisible, but it reassured me I was still going the right way. Time passed slowly in the thick woods. The sun barely filtered through the high canopy, and everything felt dim, damp, and quiet. I realized how alone I was. There was no distant hum of cars, no other hikers' voices, not even the usual constant chatter of birds. Only the crunch of my boots and the rustle of my backpack straps broke the silence. Eventually, the ground began to climb. The lookout was high on a ridge, and I could feel the incline growing steeper with every step. My breathing grew heavier, and sweat rolled down my neck. The trail disappeared entirely at points, and I had to scramble over rocks and fallen logs, always checking my compass to make sure I was staying on track. Then I came across something that gave me pause. On the ground, in a patch of mud, were fresh boot prints. They were deep, well-shaped, and pointed in the same direction I was going. Someone else had been through here recently. I crouched down and looked closely. The edges of the prints were sharp, not weathered, which meant they couldn't be more than a day old. At first, that thought was comforting. I wasn't the only person crazy enough to try this. But then a strange unease settled in. If someone else was here, why hadn't I seen them on the main trail? And who would be heading toward an abandoned lookout in the middle of nowhere? I kept moving, more aware now of the silence around me. I told myself it was nothing, just another hiker, maybe a backpacker who liked solitude. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was following someone, or worse, that someone was ahead of me, waiting. Hours passed. The sun shifted overhead, casting longer shadows. I checked my watch and realized I was behind schedule. The lookout wasn't far now, maybe another mile or so, but I could feel exhaustion creeping into my muscles. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the weight of my pack. At last, the trees thinned, and I emerged onto a rocky slope. Ahead, high above the tree-line, stood the faint outline of the fire lookout tower. It looked weathered and old, perched on metal stilts that rose against the sky. Relief washed over me. I had made it. I pushed myself up the last stretch, scrambling over rocks and loose dirt until I stood at the base of the tower. Up close, it was even more worn than I expected. The wood was gray and splintered, the metal rusted. The stairs leading up looked unstable, but they held as I climbed. At the top, I stepped onto the small platform and looked out. The view was breathtaking. Rolling forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of green broken only by distant ridges and peaks. For a moment, I forgot everything else and just stood there, catching my breath and taking it in. Inside the lookout, the air was stale and dusty. Old furniture lay scattered. A broken chair, a rusted stove, a desk with papers long since eaten by mold. The windows were dirty, some cracked. I set my pack down and drank water, trying to steady my breathing. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. In the corner, near the far wall, was a sleeping bag. It wasn't old. It looked used recently. Next to it sat a metal pot, a half-empty water bottle, and a pile of food wrappers. Someone was living here. I froze, listening. The tower was silent, but I suddenly felt exposed. If someone was staying here, where were they now? I backed away from the sleeping bag, my heartbeat quickening. The prints in the mud, the silence, the sense of being followed. All of it made sense now. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my pack and stepped back onto the platform. The sun was dipping lower, and I realized I didn't want to be anywhere near here when it got dark. I started down the stairs, my hands gripping the rusted railing tight. Halfway down, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. From somewhere below, in the trees, came the sharp crack of a branch breaking. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was deliberate, heavy, human. I crouched low on the stairs, barely breathing. My eyes scanned the forest below, but the shadows were long now, and everything blended together. Then, just for an instant, I saw movement. A figure slipping between the trees, too far to make out clearly, but unmistakably a person. I didn't wait. I hurried down the rest of the stairs, my boots clanging on the metal steps. I tightened the straps on my pack and forced myself onto the trail back down the slope. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, but the woods were silent again, as if nothing had been there. The descent was harder than I remembered. The trail was nearly invisible, and the light was fading fast. I stumbled over roots, slid on loose dirt, and scratched my arms pushing through brush. My only thought was to put distance between me and that tower. But as the forest darkened, the fear grew heavier. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me spin around. Every shadow looked like a figure. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain I would see someone following, but there was never anyone there. Hours dragged on. My legs ached and I could barely see. Finally, I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow cone. The trail markers were harder to find now, and more than once I realized I had gone off course and had to backtrack. At one point, I found another set of boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were deeper, larger, fresher. My chest tightened as I realized they were headed in the same direction I was. Whoever it was, they weren't at the tower anymore. They were down here, somewhere in the woods with me. The rest of the night blurred into a nightmare of stumbling, sweating, and scanning the darkness with my flashlight. I never saw anyone clearly, but the feeling of being followed never left me. Once, far behind me, I heard the faint snap of a branch. Another time, I caught the glint of something metallic in the distance, gone as soon as my light swept past. At last, sometime deep in the night, I stumbled back onto the main trail. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. From there, it was another long walk, but the path was wide and clear, and I pushed myself to keep moving until I saw the faint outline of my car in the trailhead. I have always liked being alone on trails, even when the miles stretched too far and the weather turned against me. Something about being far from the noise of the city made me feel clear in the head. But the hike I did that summer changed the way I looked at being alone in the woods. It stopped being about peace and started being about survival. It was July, and the air was heavy and dry. I had been looking at a loop trail in the northern mountains for weeks. It was long, close to 20 miles if I did the full circle, and it passed through a wide valley with streams, forest ridges, and exposed rocky parts where the sun beat down. Most people split it into 2 days with camping gear, but I had convinced myself I could push through it in one long day if I left before sunrise. I packed light, just water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a map folded in my pocket, and my phone with a power bank. No tent, no stove, just me, boots, and a trail that cut through miles of rough country. I parked my car at the trailhead before 5 a.m. The gravel lot was empty. The sky was still dark, but the horizon carried a dull gray glow. The air was cool in the early morning, but I knew it would heat up once the sun cleared the ridge. I strapped my pack tighter and started walking, the crunch of my boots loud on the dirt path. The first miles were easy. The trail ran flat through mixed pine and aspen forest. A thin mist hung between the trees. The ground was damp, soft from rain earlier in the week. Birds started calling as the light grew. My legs felt strong, and I kept a steady pace, breathing easy, swinging my arms to loosen up. By the time the sun was up, I was deep into the first stretch. The trail crossed small streams and climbed gradually toward higher ground. I passed a couple of wooden bridges, slick with moss, and stepped carefully so I wouldn't slip. I didn't see anyone. It was odd, but I told myself most hikers probably started later. After about 5 miles, the woods opened up to a ridge. The view was wide, valleys rolling out below with fog burning off in patches. The silence was so complete it felt heavy. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving across dry grass. I stopped for a drink and checked my map. I was right on course. The trail looped down into the valley next, then curved through denser woods before climbing again. The descent into the valley was steeper than I thought. The dirt was loose, and I had to brace my knees. The trail twisted between boulders and thick undergrowth. By then the sun was higher, and the heat pressed down. The valley air was damp and still. I pushed on, swatting at insects, drinking more water than I had planned. The deeper I went, the more the trail narrowed. The trees grew close together, trunks leaning in, branches forming a kind of tunnel. The ground was uneven, with roots sticking out. My boots caught a few times, and I stumbled but didn't fall. I started feeling the weight of the miles in my calves and hips. I stopped to eat a bar and check my water. Half of what I carried was already gone, and I wasn't even halfway around the loop. That was the first time I felt a flicker of worry. The map showed a stream farther ahead, though. I told myself I'd refill there with my filter. I kept going, but I began to notice things that made me uneasy. The trail markers grew fewer. Some were faded, nailed to trees years ago, their paint peeling. In places, fallen branches hid the path, and I had to step over or around them. At one point, I lost the trail completely when it crossed a patch of rocks. I wandered for several minutes before spotting a faint line of dirt where others had walked. The woods pressed close. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat. The silence that had felt peaceful earlier now felt oppressive. I hadn't seen a single person since the parking lot, and it was nearing noon. When I reached the stream, relief rushed through me. I knelt by the water, pulled out my filter, and filled my bottle. The cold water steadied me. I sat for a while, letting my legs rest. The valley air smelled of damp leaves and mud. But as I sat there, I thought I heard movement upstream, a soft crack of branches. Not the rustle of a squirrel, but heavier. I froze, staring through the trees. Nothing moved. No voices, no figures. Just the stream running. I forced myself to breathe slow. Maybe a deer. Maybe nothing at all. I stood, tightened my pack, and moved on. The trail beyond the stream was worse. Climbed sharply, switchback after switchback. The heat beat down harder, the air thick. Sweat stung my eyes. My thighs burned. I leaned forward, gripping my knees at times to keep going. By the time I reached the top of that climb, I was drained. My watch said I had covered close to 12 miles. That left 8 more if I stuck to the full loop. But I wasn't sure if I could keep my pace. I pulled out the map again, studying it carefully. I noticed something I had skimmed over earlier. A cut-off trail that cut across the loop, shaving off several miles. It looked less used, thinner lines marked on the paper, but it led back toward the trailhead. That sounded better than dragging myself around the long way. I found the junction a little while later. The main trail was wide, dirt packed from many boots. The cutoff was narrow, almost overgrown, grass pushing in. The wooden sign pointing the way was weathered. One corner snapped off. I hesitated, then turned onto the cutoff. At first it was fine, just rougher, less clear. But the farther I went, the less it looked like a trail. Grass grew knee-high, branches hung low. The dirt faded to patches of bare rock and mud. I kept glancing back, telling myself I was still on the right track. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print in the mud ahead, half sunk and blurred. Fresh enough that rain hadn't washed it away, but not sharp. It meant someone else had used this cutoff at some point, but how long ago? Days? Weeks? Pushed on, nerves prickling. The sun dipped behind clouds, and shadows deepened. The air cooled, but with it came a rising wind that hissed through the trees. The cutoff twisted, climbed, then dropped again. I checked the map over and over, but the lines didn't match what I saw. I couldn't tell if I had drifted off or if the trail itself was just poorly marked. Time dragged. My water ran lower. The power bank on my phone showed 2 bars left, but I had no signal. Every ridge looked the same, every hollow thick with tangled brush. My legs ached from stepping over fallen trees. My arms scratched raw from pushing branches aside. Then came the moment I realized I was lost. The cutoff trail simply ended in a patch of rocks and brush. No signs, no blazes, no clear way forward. I turned in circles, searching for the path, but all I saw were trees and stone. My stomach dropped. I walked back the way I thought I had come, but the ground looked different. The grass bent in every direction. After 10 minutes, I admitted to myself I couldn't find the trail again. Panic edged in. I fought it down, forcing myself to think. I had the map, but without knowing exactly where I stood, the paper meant little. I knew the trailhead was west, so I tried to keep the sun on my left and move steadily. But the woods grew rougher. Thick underbrush slowed me to a crawl. Rocks jutted out, slick with moss. My boots slipped, and once I fell hard on my hip, pain shooting up my side. I lay there, wind knocked out, staring at the canopy above. That was when the fear fully hit. The idea of being stuck here overnight, alone, with no trail and no one knowing where I was. I forced myself up, limping, brushing dirt from my skin. I kept walking, slower, my eyes scanning constantly for any sign of a trail. Hours seemed to pass. The light shifted toward evening. The forest darkened. At one point, I heard movement again, branches cracking behind me. I spun, heart hammering, but saw nothing. The silence closed in again, heavier than before. As dusk fell, I stumbled into a clearing. My legs trembled with exhaustion. I dropped my pack, sat on a rock, and tried to steady my breathing. The clearing was ringed with trees, the grass high in the center. No trail in sight. I decided I couldn't keep wandering in the dark. I gathered sticks and dry leaves, using my lighter to build a small fire. The flames gave me some comfort, but the shadows around the clearing seemed alive. Every snap of wood made me jump. I chewed a few bites of food, forcing myself to eat though I had no appetite. My throat was dry. I sipped the last of my water, knowing it wouldn't last till morning. Sleep came in broken stretches. I'd doze, then wake at the smallest sound. Once I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a dark shape slipping between trunks. But when I stared, it was gone. Maybe a deer, maybe just my mind. When dawn came, the fire had burned low. My body ached from the cold ground. My throat burned with thirst. I packed up and started west again, pushing through brush, eyes gritty with fatigue. Hours passed. The sun climbed high. My head throbbed. My lips cracked.